It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Africa America Institute's 10th Annual State of Education Conference. My name is Felicia Penting, and I'm the President and CEO of AAI. Over the years, we've explored questions of diaspora identity, the climate crisis and repair, and the future of African higher education through conversations with scholars, journalists, authors, practitioners, and policymakers. This year, in partnership with Howard University and Boston University, we follow a new path, the Gold Road. Our State of Education series is rooted in a simple truth, that the self-determination of Africa and the diaspora are inextricably linked. A rigorous generative understanding of Africa's history illuminates that connection. By following the Gold Road, we traced how West Africa has shaped the modern world, and we reclaim history as a compass that helps us understand who we are, where we come from, and how we navigate an ever-changing world. We began this conference a decade ago, drawing inspiration and evidence from our archives. And while the Gold Road offers special insight for educators, this gathering is open to all. Welcome, and thank you for walking this road with us.
My name is Vanessa Oyugi, and along with Brenda Randolph, I serve as the co-director of the Center for African Studies at Howard University. This year's State of Education Conference draws inspiration from the Gold Road website, a project initiated by our center in 2018. In 2020, the Boston University African Studies Center joined us as a partner in this project. A term coined by my colleague Brenda Randolph, the Gold Road reframes global medieval history by placing Africa at the center of the world economy, highlighting the role of gold and West Africa's contributions to art, architecture, learning, and governance. The Gold Road concept invites us to examine medieval West Africa through a broad lens, one that expands the familiar historical narrative of salt for gold trade to include other vital resources. And it also highlights significant historical players in addition to the one that we typically talk about, Mansa Musa. The Gold Road offers a much-needed corrective to humanities curricula that traditionally spotlight the Silk Road, while overlooking Africa's pivotal role in the same global processes and time periods. It challenges us to rethink what we teach, how we teach, and whose stories we elevate.
It's a pleasure to welcome you to today's State of Education on Africa conference. My name is Elsa Vie, and I lead the Boston University African Studies Center Education Outreach Program. We are one of the collaborating institutions on this important series hosted by the Africa America Institute. The Boston University African Studies Center has for decades promoted knowledge about Africa in K-12 schools and in higher education across the U.S. with the motto, Education about Africa for Everyone. We develop curricula, support educators with professional development, and many more resources that contribute to the expansion of knowledge about Africa. Our mission directly supports the goals of the Africa America Institute's State of Education Conference with this year's theme, Following the Gold Road. This theme is crucial in a larger project of building knowledge about the pre-colonial history of powerful African societies, their central role in world history, and their astounding legacies, knowledge that has been historically distorted in educational spaces or omitted altogether. We know that we are living in a time where politically driven policies are restricting this history. So we are pleased to go the other direction and offer Following the Gold Road series to you today.
I am very pleased to be here today, and thank you all for coming. This is a great honor to be invited to participate in this important conference. I thank Felicia and her colleagues, Vanessa, Brenda, Elsa, Hyde, and my colleague Gananjai for enabling me to share some thoughts on Africa and knowledge productions in West Africa, Ajami Manuscripts, and to highlight, as I do always in my classes, that African history did not begin in the 19th century. The world did not begin in the 19th century. And that when we focus on the 19th century, we forget enormous sources of knowledge that could enable us to revise various aspects of African history, pre-colonial history, and post-colonial Africa. So what I want to do today is to share with you the insights buried for centuries in African text written with enriched form of Arabic script called Ajami. Okay. Of course, the previous sessions have highlighted that the Sahara has never been a barrier. That the Sahara has always been crossed by camels, goods used through trade. Also, people from sub-Saharan Africa has crossed the Sahara for pilgrimages to Mecca for those who are Muslim. So the Sahara has never been a barrier. It has been a zone of communication and transmission of both culture and knowledge. As a result, in fact, the name Sahel itself tells us that locals understood the Sahel as a shore. The Arabic word Sahel comes from Sahil, which means that they saw the desert not as a barrier, but as an ocean that was crisscrossed by people using horses and camels, hence the name Sahel, which means shore. The region was called the Bilad al-Sudan. The sub-Saharan African part was called Bilad al-Sudan, meaning the country of blacks. And this image illustrates how the Sahara was crossed through pilgrimage, but also through trade and through education that bound North and Sub-Saharan Africa. Of course, we all know the significance of Timbuktu as an important center of learning, multi-ethnic, multicultural, and some estimate that Timbuktu was twice the size of London during its golden age. So clearly, the notion that history in Africa began in the 19th century is not tenable. We now have evidence that demonstrate that Timbuktu rivaled and in some cases surpassed what we found in the golden in Europe, for example, in the medieval era. What do the Ajami and Arabic texts teach us? We also tend to think that writing traditions in Africa only emerge as a result of the colonial encounter. So we don't really take into account important multilingual writing traditions of Africa. Writings that are done in Arabic, and here I should note classical Arabic and the Warsh-based classical Arabic, and also the enrichment of the Arabic script to write many African languages, a tradition called Ajami. Okay? These documents are so important because they enable us to challenge the false impression that Black Africa has no written tradition, meaning has no civilization. These documents show us that Africa has produced important multilingual African scholars, and many of them have produced masterpieces. I call them local Shakespeares and local Chaucers in most communities you would find leading scholars, well-known, whose works, whose masterpieces are recited and discussed in communities. But these are clearly not included in knowledge production about Africa. I should note that these scholars tend to be multilingual. They might write in Arabic if they're interested in reaching the larger Muslim community, but they might write in Ajami, meaning they might write in the local language, if it's Hausa or Wolof or Fula, to convey their messages and their teachings to the local audiences. And these traditions have emerged at least since the 10th century. Unfortunately, the work of these important scholars have largely been excluded from history textbooks and the media. Many early visitors reported the significance of literacy in Muslim West Africa. For example, Sir Francis Moore of the Royal African Company of England, Ibn Battuta in the 14th century, Leo Africanus in the 15th century, Mungo Park in the 18th century, and others noted the significance of literacy and learning centers in West Africa. Another important figure, Baron Roger, the French governor of Senegal, stated that more Negroes could read and write in Arabic in 1828 than French peasants could in French. Okay. So beside the Arabic sources, there are also over 80 African languages, and this is important, over 80 African languages written in Ajami script, meaning African languages written with enriched forms of the Arabic script, just like the Latin script was enriched and modified to write many European languages. However, Ajami literates are excluded from official literacy statistics because literacy is defined as the ability to read and write only in European languages and the ability to use the Latin script. Clearly, this narrow Eurocentric view of literacy promoted by African governments and international organizations, unfortunately, continues to omit millions of Ajami literates from official literacy statistics. Okay? And it's also important to highlight here the notions of Francophone, Anglophone, Lusophone literature omit these important Ajami traditions that predate them. So here I want to give you a sense of how Ajami works. Clearly, the Wolof language has consonants that do not exist in Arabic. For example, these consonants p, g, ny, ng, all these consonants do not exist in Arabic. So Wolof scholars had to enrich the Arabic script to be able to render these consonants. In the Wolof case, there are 3 dots. In the b, for the g, they generally add 3 dots. For the ny, they generally add 3 dots on the jim. Okay, but because this system is not standardized, you might find variations in text that are produced by Wolof scholars. Okay, it's important to note that these variations do not pose problems to insiders. They pose problems to outsiders who cannot anticipate the consonant that is expected, but these are clearly understandable by locals who are familiar with the local writing systems. Okay, so for the Wolof, they use 3 dots. The Hausa the Hausa convention might decide to use 1 dot. The Fulani convention might decide to use 1 dot above or below. These are the conventions that have been used by different African communities to be able to produce writing systems to write their languages and produce both prose and poetic text of significance in over 80 languages. Okay? So it's interesting to note that the enrichment process is really done by the use of what I call the powerful dots. The number of dots, the placement of dots are some of the most effective ways that the Arabic script has been enriched to write African languages. How does one acquire these writing systems? This is a picture that shows young children in Casamance, in the Mandinka area, where I am from. It's in the Seju area. And you can see that children attend Quranic schools with these wooden tablets, okay? Usually around 7, but of course the young ones want to hang out because it's fun to be around, okay? And through these wooden tablets, they read the Quran, they study the Quranic verses, okay, like in these tablets. And when they memorize these verses, another verse is written until, the complete Quran is mastered and memorized. Okay. Through this process, these children are exposed to 2 forms of literacies. First, they're exposed to the Arabic literacy, particularly the Warsh-based classical Arabic that is used in these Quranic schools. Okay. Then they're also exposed to the local Mandinka Ajami traditions that are produced by important local scholars and poets like Sito Koto Dabo, who is really the equivalent of the Shakespeare for the Mandinka. Okay? So through this process, these children are exposed to multiple forms of literacies. Okay? And you can see as they move through their education processes from the elementary level, they're exposed to this Warsh script, okay? And these are through Quranic verses that they study, okay? And you could see, for example, Asfala Safilin, that the fur here, the dot is under. This is not the same as modern standard Arabic that is studied today, for example, in schools. Okay, this is part of what we call the Warsh-based classical Arabic that they study. So they acquire literacy in this Warsh system, in addition to the local Ajami tradition. When they move from the elementary level, they go to the second level, where the students are expected to write a copy of the Quran from memory. Okay, so you see here an example of a child from a Wolof society, a 15-year-old boy who is writing his first handwritten copy of the Quran in Tuba. Okay, so here first they write the entire text, and then they add the vocalization. Through this process, they also learn calligraphy. They decorate this text. Okay, I should note that the text, for example, does not have numbers, pagination, but they use what I call pointers. The first word of the next page is used as a pagination. Okay. When they're done with that phase, they have produced a complete copy of the Quran, well decorated. It has to be evaluated by scholars. And of course, the teacher has to review the documents to make sure there is no mistake, because one mistake would require rewriting the entire document. Okay, so here we have an example of an important leading scholar in the Murid community who is reviewing the work that has been produced by one of his students, and that process is called topat. Okay. When the students continue and they go beyond that level, at the advanced level, they produce multilingual texts like this. Texts that include Arabic, but also it could include multiple languages. Glosses that include Mandinka and Soninke, for example, in the Mandinka community. In the Fula community, you might have texts that are in classical Arabic Warsh, but including glosses in Fula and Wolof. Okay, so they become multilingual and multiliterate scholars. Okay. And of course, this is just one example. Some of the works they do include serving as editors, as publishers, like this Serigne by Modou Diagne, who is a professional copy editor of Arabic and Wolof Ajami texts reviewing 5,000 copies of classical Arabic poems by Sheikh Ahmadu Bamba, the founder of the Muridiyya. Okay? So it's really unfair to regard these people as illiterate. In fact, they're multilingual and multiliterate. Okay? It's also important to note that these traditions are not exclusively done by men. Women have also contributed in the production of important documents in both Arabic and Ajami. And of course, the most famous one that we know is Nana Asma'u, the daughter of Usman Danfodio in northern Nigeria. But in the Murid community, for example, we have documents that have been produced, important documents, both in Arabic and Ajami by the daughters of Sheikh Ahmadu Bamba, for example. Okay? The one that is most popular is, for example, the poem produced by Sohna Maimunatu Mbake Jr., okay, who wrote an important poem in 1974, between 1974 and 1975, in which she presents her condolences to her husband and family for her daughter they lost at a young age. Okay. So what we're missing really when we don't take into account these Ajami documents is enormous. Okay. What I have here is simply a drop in the ocean of knowledge that we have that have not been studied. Okay. So the content of the materials that I will talk about here is only from the small collection of Ajami texts, which is about 30,000 pages that we have now at BU, that reflects the themes that are produced by scholars, by African Ajami scholars. The documents include Islamic devotional and didactic text in prose and poetry, elegies, works on Islamic metaphysics, jurisprudence, theology, Sufism, prayers, exegesis of the Quran in African languages, divination, documents dealing with astrology and astronomy, calendar making, time calculations, secular writings such as commercial, bureaucratic, and administrative record keeping, legal rulings, documents dealing with history, hagiographies, biographies, genealogies. We have documents that record of key local events such as the foundation of mosques and villages, birth and death records, speeches, sermons, personal correspondence, local treatment of illnesses. We have documents dealing with medicinal plants, talismanic protective devices, incantations. We have collections of proverbs and riddles. We have diaries. We have documents dealing with moral codes, ancestral traditions. We have texts dealing with diplomatic matters. And some of the most recent documents that have been produced by the new generation of Ajami writers include texts dealing with pollution, the environment, agriculture, immigration, human rights, parental obligations, fatherhood and motherhood. We have texts dealing with corruption, political and social satire, public health issues such as COVID-19. We have texts dealing with advertisements, road signs, public announcements, good governance. And finally, we have texts on language, including whether God is monolingual or multilingual, and whether African languages are appropriate for Islamic discourse. Okay, so we're missing a lot when we don't include these sources in knowledge production about Africa. Okay, we have texts dealing with defending, for example, Sufi traditions against the threat of Wahhabism. Okay. Another important aspect that I think is often misunderstood is this the significance of this Arabic alphanumeric system in Islamic education in West Africa. For example, what you have here is a text that teaches the Arabic alphabet, the Abajada, with their numerical values, okay, and it's spelled out in Mandinka. For example, the alif, the value is 1, and it's killing in Mandinka. The ba is 2, and it's spelled out in Mandinka as Fula, and the entire Arabic alphabet and its numerical values are provided to teach both numeracy but also literacy. It's important to note that this scholar, for example, this is an important educational material that the writer knows the variations between the Gharb and the Sharq, the Western tradition and the Eastern tradition. Okay? And these systems are used in medicine, in protection, in good luck charms, in divination, in astrology, in record keeping, in calendar making, in mathematics. They also use, for example, in writing dates, chronograms. Okay. I think this would be a very important contribution. This could contribute significantly to the work of historians who assume that Africans don't date their documents. Well, in many cases, the convention is most of these writers do not date using numbers. They date their documents using letters, chronograms. For example, Ayakashi, this is a date. It might look like gibberish for somebody who do not understand the system. But if you understand the system, you know that they know that the alif, the ya, the qa, the sha, each of them has a value. Okay? And in this system, they only count the value of the consonants. So which means Ayakashi, the ya is 10, the qa is 100, the sha is 1,000, and in the Muslim calendar, it's 1,110, Anum Hijra, the Muslim calendar. If you convert that to the Gregorian calendar, it gives you 1698. Okay? To fully understand the writing of African Muslims on the continent and those enslaved in the diaspora, one must understand this alphanumeric table. It is significant. That knowledge is also deployed, for example, in magical squares and formulas, like in this formula. Okay? And the document is used for protection, okay, to solve, but also is used to solve people's problems. Okay, but what happened in many of these documents, the instructions may be omitted. Okay, for example, in this case, this figure protects. It says the writer's note in the document that this figure protects against anything harmful, but the instruction on how to use this formula is omitted. The same is true here. The author writes, write this formula if you have any problem, but the instruction is omitted. In this case, omission is one way to protect the information because they understand that this knowledge system can be used for good, but it could also be used for bad purposes. And therefore, omission in this case is like a password, a way to protect the information from misuse, requiring the person who is interested in this knowledge to go to the person, to the owner or the writer, so that they can be vetted, so that the owner will make sure that this person has the moral credentials to be given the full knowledge. Okay, so this is very interesting that they provide information, but they often omit important information to make sure that the knowledge does not fall on the wrong hands. Okay, this tradition again continues in the diaspora, and we find more recently, for example, a document in the Gambia produced by Lamin Danfa, a 3-page document listing 45 Mandinka rulers who reigned for 625 years in the Jara Japine area of the Gambia. So this is the area where Alex Ale obviously traced his roots in his very popular novel, Roots, the Saga of an African-American Family. In the Fouta Djallon area of Guinea, we also found an important text, and this text was produced by one of the scholars who captures some of the 99 leading scholars of Fouta Djallon who lived between the 16th and the 20th century. Okay, this is again the area where Abdurrahman, who is subjected in the film Prince, who is the subject of the film Prince Among Slaves, is from. Okay, my team and I just finished digitizing 50,000 pages of endangered classical Arabic and Fula Ajami text from this area, including an important document that was produced probably around the time when Abdurrahman was there. Okay. So here we have a copy of the Quran, a 400-year copy of the Quran at the Musée du Fouta Djallon in Labé, which was our partner when we were conducting research there. Of course, these traditions have been carried in the United States. As you can see, for example, the decoration system here that is produced in Fouta Djallon is also present in some of the writings of Omar ibn Said, okay, one of the most famous enslaved Africans in the United States that you know about, okay, and who had written, for example, his biography. But what I find very interesting is that besides the continuation of this African tradition, he has continued his Ajami tradition, okay, by writing the names, for example, of his master, in Ajami using the Arabic script. And in this case, again, using the Warsh Arabic script, not modern standard Arabic. For example, Shufaya Owen, the F here is clearly West African Warsh, not the modern standard Arabic. Another document that I think is very important, and the reason why I think studying this document in new ways would be very useful in contributing to slave narratives. This is an important document that was found by my colleague, Dr. Mustafa Kulfi, in 2017 at Harvard University, Stacks. Okay? And clearly this document includes an incantation. The only thing that's Arabic here is Bismillahir Rahman. Okay, the rest is an incantation, that was deployed as a way in the person's struggle for freedom. Okay, we see here, for example, that this text was written in Mandinka. We can tell by these conventions. These are Mandinka Ajami convention. So this is linking Sang Mang Lang Wing Mang Fang Ming Wang. We know these are features of Mandinka. So, and we also know that these unique letters actually refer to a spirit. Okay, so the person was clearly using an incantation, invoking a spirit, in 1789, in his spiritual struggle for freedom. Okay, what can we learn from such texts? I think with such texts we can now learn the level of education of the writer, the regional conventions, like the Mandinka, if the person was Mandinka or Hausa or Fulani, the communities of origin, the epistemological traditions that they have continued in the Americas, not only in the United States, but also in Brazil. For example, this text was produced in Brazil. Okay, the psychological state of the writer. Okay, and these insights could contribute in new ways to slave narratives. Okay, and in conclusion, the bulk of the materials discussed in this lecture remains untranslated and unknown to many academics across the humanities and social sciences. Okay? The insights in this document force revision of various aspects of our understanding of pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial Africa. They enable us to go beyond the stereotypical simple single story of Africa as a continent of illiteracy and orality. They enable us to see the world and hear unfiltered voices of ordinary and learned Africans on the continent and in the diaspora, never heard before. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the conversation.
Professor Ngom, thank you so much for an illuminating talk. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ganajai, and I'm honored to be in conversation with Professor Ngom on this important topic. I also want to thank Felicia, Brenda, Vanessa, Elsa, Hyde, and everybody else who has been instrumental in making this conference happen. I also like to thank our other colleagues who were here in the other sessions of the conference, especially Professor Mike Gomez, Professor Medina Cham, Professor Sarah Gerin, and Yinka Adi Goke. Professor Ngom, this is an illuminating talk, and I want to start with your conclusion, right? That's the myth of African orality and illiteracy. But I would like for us to sort of talk a little bit more about the genesis of scripts in Africa. Could you say a little bit more about the different, the most popular, I would say, indigenous African script and how they came to be? And what is also the genesis of the Arabic script itself, right? And how does the study of Ajami allow us to sort of debunk the myth that there is a dichotomy between orality and literacy in Africa? Because even those who defend Africa, those who sort of write against this Eurocentric view of Africa that portrays Africa as a continent of orality, of orality, and then they tend to sort of emphasize orality as if orality is separate from writing in Africa, right? That then writing becomes European and orality becomes African, right? And that kind of creates this dichotomy. Could you also speak a little bit more about that when you sort of give us a portrait of the different script and how rich actually a written tradition Africa has?
Great. Well, thank you very much, Professor Njai. These are important questions. I think that one of the biggest challenges we face in knowledge production about Africa is what I often call the linguistic paradox in academia, right? So that we require people to study English if they're studying America or if they're studying England. We require people to study French if they're studying French culture, or French history, or French civilization. Right? We require people to study Chinese if they're studying Chinese culture and Chinese history. But there is no such requirement in academia for people who are studying Africa. So African languages have never been treated as central in accessing local knowledge. So that's the first structural problem we have. Okay? And that's one of the reasons why these sources of knowledge have been completely excluded from knowledge production about Africa. And I should note that, in fact, the conversations about Ajami and Arabic script does not mean that all scripts that are used to produce important sources of knowledge are only Arabic based. Of course, we have, for example, Ge'ez in Ethiopia. In other parts of Africa, we have other scripts like Bamung, the Bamung script, for example, in Cameroon. Okay. In the Mande area now, we have, for example, Dunko script, which is also used as a way to actually unite the larger traditional Mande society. Okay. There are many scripts that have, and then there's another one that I think is probably the most fascinating one that remains under research, a chromatographic writing system, a writing system that's based on color and shape. And that's the only one in the world. And this is produced by the Edo people of Benin. And so the point is, besides the Ajami and Arabic, there are other important sources of knowledge about Africa that remain unexplored and unstudied because of the legacy, the intellectual dependency and assumptions that literacy began in Africa with the arrival of Europeans. Okay? So that's the biggest problem. And of course, that's related to your secondary question, which is the dichotomies. The tendency is to treat orality and writing as mutually exclusive, just as the religious and the secular world are treated as separate, just as the natural world and the supernatural world are treated as mutually exclusive. Well, these are external frameworks to Africa. Because if you interrogate African text, if you interrogate knowledge systems of Africa, you see that these domains are mutually complementary. They are not mutually exclusive. Right? Let's take an example. Let's take a poem. A poem that is produced by Musaka, the Wall of Shakespeare, or Sito Koto Dabo, the Mandinka Shakespeare, or Terno Mombeya, the Fula Shakespeare. The poem can be written in Arabic and Ajami, but it's meant to be declaimed and chanted. Where do you draw the line? Is this an oral document? Is this an exclusive written document? It is both. Okay. The same is true if you interrogate the text. Orality and writing literacy are interlaced just as the spiritual world and the temporal world are interlaced. Okay? Mm-hmm. And I think one of the benefits of investing in training the new generation of scholars in having access to local languages is to have access to these epistemologies, to these principles that that form the African knowledge systems. And I think that's what I hope is going to be our job. How do we train the new generation of students so they're better trained than us, so they have access to these knowledge systems by developing competence in local languages, but also in this variety of scripts beyond Ajami and Arabic. So thank you very much for this wonderful question.
Yeah. And I would also add maybe that that when people think of Ajami as an original because it is a modification of Arabic, they also need to remember the fact that Arabic itself as a script is a modification of other scripts, right?
That's true. Very true. So, very true. Very true.
Yeah. I know that this is also another important part of what Ajami does. I think that the study of Ajami in Africa allows us also to understand race relations, and especially in the Muslim world. In 1591, when Sultan Al-Mansur of Morocco invaded Timbuktu, and Ahmed Baba was exiled to Marrakesh, he spent 12 years there and wrote a lot of treaties. In those legal treaties, he spoke about slavery in the Muslim world and why it is illegal to enslave Black Muslims, right? And that kind of debate seems to me continues in the Ajami literary tradition. This encounter between Arabs and Blacks, between those from the Middle East and those from Bilad al-Sudan, as you say. How do Ajami scholars, especially in the Wolof in the Wolof areas that you study, in West Africa in general, speak about race?
It's a great question. I think I'm going to back up a little bit and touch on the issue you've touched earlier, and that is that the principles, for example, that Ajami uses deploying in their conventions to write, say, Hausa, Wolof, etc., from the longue durée are the same principles that produce Arabic script itself. Okay, I mean the Arabic script was produced as a result of the enrichment and the modification of the Aramaic script. And in fact, we have dots. Okay. So it's this, if you look at it from a longue durée, it's those same principles that are still being used to produce, Wolof Ajami and Hausa Ajami, and Spanish Ajami for those in Europe. Okay. So it's important to highlight that, as indigenous forms of innovations that follow long durée traditions. Okay, so I think that's a very important one. Of course, the issue of what is legitimate language of Islam is often tied also to race, to issues of race. Right? In the Ajami world, virtually every major Ajami writer had to deal with the issue of whether Ajami is a legitimate language of Islamic discourse. Whether God is Arabic speaker or whether God is multilingual. Okay? And these issues clearly are rooted in racial relationships, in the prestige associated with Arabs and Arabic. Okay. And I have to say, I find this very, very interesting. And I have framed them actually as the dialogue between people who follow the monoglossic ideology of language versus people who follow the polyglossic ideology of language. Most Ajami users follow the polyglossic ideology of language, believing that no ethnic group or racial group is superior to any other group, that diversity is a form of divine blessings. That's what led Musa Ka to write Takhmis bu Wolof, to highlight that any language that can be used as a tool to convey the divine message acquires prestige. And that prestige is not rooted in one's race or in one's inherent qualities that belong to Arabs. Okay, so I think you find, and what I find very interesting, you find similar responses, for example, among the Mandinka. Okay. Similar positions are also taken, for example, by Cherno Mombeya in Fouta Djallon. I should remind you, in Fouta Djallon, when Elhaj Omar Tal, a major Tijaniya jihad leader in the 19th century West Africa, encountered Cherno Mombeya when he was writing his masterpiece now called Ogir de Malal, the vein of eternal happiness. Omar Tal told him, well, why are you writing in your local Fulani language in Ajami? Mm-hmm. Is this not going to put in danger the language of Prophet Muhammad, the language of the Quran? Of course, at that point, Elhaj Omar was very powerful, and if Elhaj Omar confronts you about an issue, you have to respond. Cherno Mombeya had to respond and explain to Elhaj Omar, how would I ensure that the farmers, the herders, would have access to the knowledge and the teachings of the Quran, the ethical teachings of the Quran and Prophet Muhammad, if I don't use their tongue? Okay. And so the point is the issue of Arabic as the language of Islam, as the sole language of Islam, and Arabs are the only legitimate and superior ethno-linguistic group within the Ummah, has been challenged by these Ajami scholars. And I think that conversation is actually still going on. For example, the younger generations of Ajami writers are actually continuing these conversations that challenge notions of racial or linguistic superiority. You know, they highlight that any language that is used to convey divine message and that is used to expand lessons of morality and plurality and embracing human values are equally important. So thank you very much. That's an important, very important question that is often, I think, not addressed. But I think what we find in the Ajami tradition is a challenge. That challenge is very, very, very clear in the works of Ajami leaders, Ajami writers, not only among the Wolof, you find it among the Mandinka and others who differentiate Islamization from Arabization. Okay. They do not think that being a Muslim requires losing one's identity. Okay.
Yeah, this is a fascinating debate, and also a debate that is not only limited to Africa, because in 1549, Joachim Dibele, a French poet, wrote Défense et illustration de la langue française, defense and illustration of the French language, basically saying to his contemporaries that they should use less Latin and less Greek and more French, because that is only through the use of French that you are going to develop these languages, right? So the hegemony of Greek and Latin here, but the hegemony of Arabic in West Africa, at least in Islamic West Africa. But also the debate, I think, about race brings us to another aspect, right, a related aspect, which is ethnicity in Africa. The scholarship on ethnic conflict on the continent tends to also fall into two categories. There are those who say, well, the reason for the conflict is because these arbitrary borders that we inherited from colonization have brought together people who belong to different ethnic groups. And they have been lumped together, and that's why there is conflict. Others will say, well, the reason for the conflict is because these arbitrary borders have separated groups that belong together in the first place, right? And I think, in my opinion, both of these positions assume a sort of rigidity in ethnic boundaries on the continent. When I read your work, there is this sense that ethnicity is plastic, that actually the Wolof poet may not be ethnically Wolof, right? Could you speak a little bit about Ajami and how it allows us to understand ethnic boundary making in the continent?
I think I'm going to share one to answer that question. This slide that I think is very important, that touches really the point that you were making. Of course, the tendency is to look at ethnicity as rigid in Africa, without realizing that actually ethnicity is very plastic and elastic in many parts of Africa. So this text, for example, highlights the family of Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, the genealogy of the family, of the Mbake family of Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba from the 17th to the 20th century. It shows the maternal and paternal lineages of Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba from the Fulani ethnic group to the full Wolofization of the family. As the family moved from Fouta Toro in northern Senegal, they moved to Wolof areas. They became Wolofized gradually. The documents even tells us the first person who was fully Wolofized and spoke only Wolof and lost completely their Fulani linguistic competence. So, which means, in fact, the tendency to emphasize ethnicity as a source of course, in some areas, in small-scale societies, where ethnicity is emphasized, okay, ethnicity is a source of conflict in those cases. But the general rule is in large-scale societies, whether it's the Mande society or the Wolof society, this large-scale society, ethnicity is very, very elastic. Okay? And this is just normal because of the long traditions of interactions and mixing. Okay? If you take, for example, the Wolof society, the Mandinka society, the Hausa Fulani society, these are societies whose cosmopolitanism preceded colonization as a result of trade, as a result of Islamic education. In fact, Islamic education has created, because of the tradition of peripatetic learning, where people would travel to learn. So you have Fula people who will go to the Wolof and learn, or you have Mandinka people who go to the Fula and learn. You have Fula people who go to the Wolof and learn. Through these, and then, of course, those who would go to the Arab world, North Africa and other parts. Okay? Through these educational channels, if you graduate, you might marry, for example, in the family of your teacher. We have many families, actually, that have emerged as a result of these peripatetic educational traditions. Okay? And so the result is that before even the 19th century, many of these communities, ethnicity was already elastic. Okay? And I think these Ajami documents, for example, allow us, to trace these ethnicities, how ethnicity is actually not rigid, that is elastic in many cases. And I think many of us, like myself, recognize ourselves in this system. My mom is 50% Pular. Her mom is Yete So. Her last name is So. My dad is 100% Serer. Okay, my last name Ngom. So I am also part of this, this world of the flexibility of ethnicity. So thank you very much. That's an important question. Thank you.
Yeah. I will ask one last question before we open it up to the Q&A. I know that there are quite a few questions already, but please do send your questions. If you're in the audience and have a question, please use the Q&A box to send us your questions. We'll try to get to them. But I will ask one last question, and it really ties to also the issue of race and the mobilities between Muslim communities in Africa, but also from Africa to the Middle East. Professor Usman Khan spoke about, genealogical acrobatics, right? The fact that certain people will always claim being of Sharifian blood, etc. But I wanted to tie that question of the issue of genealogy and how these movements of people who might be born in one ethnic group, and then because they become religious scholars, they start claiming Sharifian blood or certain Arabic lineages. I want to tie that to the trip of Mansa Musa to Mecca, his pilgrimage to Mecca. Professor Mike Gomez and Professor Medina Cham in their session, they spoke about the conditions that created these communities, right, in West Africa that flourish, that allow for this wealth to accumulate, for Mansa Musa to travel, and the meaning of it. Professor Gomez talked about the baraka that he brought back, right, from Mecca. But there is one aspect that I think is connected to your work also, is what did Mansa Musa bring back? What is the significance in terms of knowledge production in Africa? What is the significance of Mansa Musa's Hajj, right? Beyond the fact that, he was the richest man on earth, and there is even recent research in AI, people claiming that he looked like Kanye West, right? Trying to reconstruct what he looked like based on historical figures. Those are interesting questions, of course, but I think that the tangible material that we have that allow us to talk more about him connect to really some of the things that you spoke about here.
Well, thank you very much. I think that's a very important question. The tendency, of course, is to emphasize the wealth of Mansa Musa and how he traveled on his way to pilgrimage, distributed a lot of gold because he was the man of that period. He was the wealthiest person, and distributed gold to people until the price of gold fell in Egypt. Okay, but you're right that people don't emphasize equally how Mansa Musa did actually what most universities do now. So Mansa Musa also recruited the leading scholars of the time, the leading architects. He had the money, just like what Boston University or Harvard or Howard might do and say, Professor Njai, would you like to come to Boston University? What do you need in terms of resources? So Mansa Musa did the same and brought back some of the leading scholars and architects back to Mali. Okay. But what is also very interesting is that he invested a lot of resources bringing these people back, hoping that these people were the leading scholars in their field. But when confronted with the local scholars, the organic, homegrown scholars, it turned out that homegrown scholars were actually more educated than the people he brought. And that was a big surprise. But to scholars, that's not surprising, because Timbuktu, again, continued the tradition of multi-literacy and formed a multi-ethnic group that drew from north, east, south, and west. And so it was a major center of learning that drew from multiple sources. And I think that's very important to highlight that, in fact, the disappointment of Mansa Musa after spending all those resources to realize that actually the homegrown scholars were actually more educated than the people he brought. I have a more recent, actually, evidence of this. Among the documents that we just finished digitizing from Guinea in Fouta Djallon, I found some documents that are pre-Islamic. So these people were reading documents. They were reading documents that predated Islam. And so I have identified a few documents that are actually dealing with pre-Islamic ports. Okay, and so the point is, they were well educated beyond, the Islamic domain. They read very widely. And to conclude on that, and to tie it to the genealogies that you talk about, I think that's a very interesting. The tradition, of course, in the Ummah and Islam in general, having biological relationship with the Prophet is very important source of prestige, right? The Sharifian tradition, right? Of course, Muslims around the world have claimed those connection to the Prophet, as a way to acquire prestige. Okay, some cases that's true, but in some some cases it's very difficult to confirm those. Okay, and of course these are being referred to as acrobatic genealogies or fabricated genealogies. Okay, but they serve important purposes. For example, in West Africa, we know that some of these connections, these fabricated connections, genealogies to claim Sharifian identity were used as a way to escape enslavement, for example. Because, of course, during the trans-Saharan trade, the Muslim slave trade, of course, as you noted, Ahmad Baba dealt with the issue of who is enslavable and who is not enslavable. And of course, in his view, following the Maliki tradition, a Muslim cannot be enslaved. Okay? Of course, if you're a Sharif, I mean, no one would think about enslaving you. So which means that some people have created these fabricated genealogies to connect their families to the Prophet as a way to escape slavery. So that's one point. The second point is that sometimes the leaders themselves may not claim Sharifian descent, but it may be their fervent disciples who do the job for them. Okay? And I think we have cases like that in the Murid tradition, right? Even though Sheikh Ahmadu Bamba himself refers to anyone who is righteous as Sharif. Bamba did not believe in Sharifian descent just based on blood. For him, Sharifian descent was based on ethics and morality. So that's why Bamba said, anyone who is righteous is a Sharif. Well, it's interesting to find some of the Murid followers zealous to claim Sharifian blood of Bamba or his mother or Saint Fallo. Okay, so but again, these are, I think, important traditions that are connected, okay, to the original ummah. Really, the sources of prestige and barakah that Professor Gomez talks about, and Medina Cham, and even your own work. So thank you very much for asking this great question.
Yeah, the issue of genealogical or biological silsila is a very fascinating debate in West Africa. But I know that we running out of time here, but I learned that we can have an extra 7 to 8 minutes to do this. So let me get to the question. I will try to combine some of them. Our colleague Emily Riley is asking, the ways in which people are using oral forms of communicating, right, like WhatsApp, etc., but also how Ajami fits into the debate. And I think that question ties to the other one that somebody asked, who is using Ajami today, right?
That's a great question. It's interesting, depending on the communities. For example, the flourishing of Ajami varies. Okay? But Ajami is flourishing very well in the Murid community. You have a whole new generation who are using Ajami and making sketches. For example, Damjane is a very popular one. And there's a great presence online, actually. And he uses WhatsApp. In fact, I just received yesterday a poem that he wrote in Ajami to celebrate the Senegalese soccer team that just won the African Cup. Okay, so among the Murids, they have embraced technology and are using Ajami in conveying their poems and their writings. Okay, in the Fouta Djallon area where I was recently, they embrace less technology And I think it's just because of limited exposure. I mean, the internet access, that they have limited resources compared to, say, the folks that I find in Tuba, for example. Okay, but in Nigeria too, Ajami is being used in social media, and Mustafa Kurfi and others, especially Professor Adamu, has done some work in that area. So the point here is that despite the lack of recognition of Ajami as an important grassroots form of literacy, it's not dead. You can buy the production of Ajami documents continue. They have their own scribes that produce these market edition that Hunwick called market edition that you could buy in local bookstores, for example, in Tuba. Okay, and reciters of Ajami of Wolof poems, for example, can be found. Some of them are actually very famous. Okay, and here you have again the duality I highlighted earlier, that these are not mutually exclusive. The same people who are experts or specialists in declaiming or chanting the Arabic poetry of Bamba are also the same people who recite Wolof Ajami poetry. Take the case, say, for example, of Abdullah Touré, for example. And so, and online you can find some of these great poems of Musaka, for example, being chanted. And for example, Kharnubi, you can find it online. And the last point here, what I find so fascinating is that what I call music-derived pedagogies or music-derived literacies is a phenomenon that is taking place online, meaning that in the past, Ajami poems were meant to be read out loud in rural villages. And later, it was recorded, Ajami poems were recorded in cassettes, 90-minute and 60-minute cassettes. Later, during the times of DVD, Ajami and Arabic poems of Khasaids were put in DVDs. Now, that has moved online. Okay, so which means in the past you had people whose conversion to Muridiya actually came from the poems they listened to, that they heard in their communities, like Jazawu Shakur, the Odyssey of Sheikh Ahmadu Bamba, Bof Odyssey, the Odyssey dealing with his deportation to Gabon, and then the one dealing with his peripecias in Mauritania and house arrest. Those narratives that were written by the Wolof Ajami poet, most famous, maybe the local Shakespeare, could be called Musaka, were recited, then recorded, and then recited in rural areas, converted many people into the Muridiya. And many people first learned these stories and learned the script because they were interested in these fantastic stories. They later learned the scripts. So that tradition is now moving online, and I think it's very interesting to investigate how new Africans in the diaspora, especially new Senegalese, are actually acquiring the same knowledge and acquiring new forms of literacy, both in classical Arabic and Ajami, by listening to these time-aligned recitations online. Okay, so I think this is an area of investigation that's related to Emily's question, showing how Ajami has actually moved into the digital space. Okay? And then there are a lot of links. If you just go online and Google Musaka or Mbaye Jakhate or Samba Diarra Mbaye, you will see a lot of resources, both audio and video. So it's flourishing despite the lack of official recognition by the Senegalese government and other African government that continue to treat literacy as only those who are literate in European languages. It has not displaced and destroyed Ajami. Ajami continues to be used as important means of grassroots communication, including in many fields, including public health, for example, road science, and more practical things like record keeping and so on. So thank you.
Yeah, we have many questions here and we are running out of time, but I think this one also is something that we have not touched upon yet, which is the gender dimension. My friend Sonia is asking where to find these resources. The Ajami Library at Boston University has everything that has been digitized and all these things, project that Professor Ngam has worked on. But Sonia is asking if there are resources on female Ajami writers and who are those people like Nana Asmau, for example, in Nigeria. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, so of course there are not a lot of female writers, but there are important ones that I have found whose work have not been studied yet. And these are particularly those that I have found in the Muridiya community. Okay? Most of the daughters of Sheikh Ahmadu Bamba have produced both Arabic and Ajami texts. Okay, and you can find some of their texts in Tuba. If you have contact with people in Tuba, I'm sure they could get you copies of Sohna Mai, the writings that she has produced. But the general tendency, of course, has been, in general, Ajami tradition have been neglected. And when Ajami tradition themselves began to be studied by people like us, of course, the most common text that we find is text produced by men. Okay, but there is a corpus of Ajami texts produced by women that are unstudied. And finally, among the youngest generation, and I mean the new generation in Tuba, if you go to our website, the text that we have translated in Project RIA, readers in Ajami, you will find there, for example, poems that are written by the new generation of young female Ajami writers in Tuba. There are at least, I think, two of them whose work have been featured there. So this is an area I think that deserves to be studied, But I should note again that just like their male counterparts, these scholars are bilingual and biliterate. They have produced texts of equal importance in the Warsh-based Arabic and in the Ajami tradition. Okay, so I think both are important. So I think where to find them, you could find them in their communities. The ones I know, for example, you could find them in Tuba. If you have connections with people in Tuba, I'm sure they could get you some of those. Some of them you could probably buy. If you ask the booksellers in the areas of Tuba and Murid communities, you might find copies of their work. Okay, and our library, again, our RIA project and our NES Ajami project, in which Professor Njai has contributed. We have translated many Ajami poems, including one that's also very important, produced, co-authored by one of the daughters of Sheikh Ahmadu Bamba, Sohna Ami Sheikh, and the Wall of Shakespeare. That's online. That's on our NEH project. It's called, I think, Walafalu Sohna Mai, if my mind serves well. You can find that, or if you send me an email, I will be happy to send you the link. Okay. So these are there. These works are there. I think they deserve attention, so that the corpus of the writers in Arabic and Ajami is not limited only to the works of Nana Asma'u, okay, of northern Nigeria. So we can expand that by more work on these female writers. So thank you very much for that question.
I'll take two questions and we'll try to end it here because I think we've gone over time. But somebody is saying, what are the challenges to deciphering Ajami writing, Ajami documents, and what advice do you have for young scholars? And the second one, I would just ask you the questions right briefly here. How do you think the examination, and this is a question from our colleague Elsa from BU, how do you think the examination of Ajami and Arabic knowledge writing and knowledge production to study the diaspora outside of Africa might reshape the field? I think this is a good question to end with. What are the perspectives?
Very good, very good. On the first question, the big challenge is, I think, what I touched on to be able, for the new generation, is to invest in African languages and scripts the same way you would invest in French or Chinese if you were going to study these cultures. There's no other way. Okay? The problem is you have to overcome the linguistic paradox in academia. You have to take, say, for example, if you're interested in Wall of Ajami or Hausa Ajami or Mandinka Ajami, the language, the Mandinka language, Wall of language, and Swahili Hausa language is required. There's no other way out. You have to study that language to the advanced level, and work with local scholars who know the script, the enrichment of the Arabic script, First, you have to know that the Arabic script that is used in most of this Ajami tradition is not based on modern standard Arabic. And I need to emphasize that. It's based on the classical Warsh-based Arabic, where there are variations. For example, the f in the Warsh, the dot is under. The qa only has one dot. So you have to know the classical Arabic script, that the Warsh-based Arabic script that is already that they use as a base, and the enrichment that the Wolof have made on that, or the enrichment that the Mandinka have made on that, or the enrichment of whatever community scholars have made on that. So I say, for those students who are interested in addressing this challenge, invest in learning the language, okay, and invest in learning the script by engaging with local scholars, okay? And if you're interested in Wolof and Hausa, we've produced at Boston University elementary and intermediate level documents that can allow you to study and acquire Hausa and Wolof Ajami literacy, okay? On our website, we have also resources, especially the RIA one, we have resources for advanced level. I think if you combine these resources with the study of the language, you might acquire competence in those two languages. But for the other one, you have to do the investment in the local languages and the local script. And to the question of Elsa, that's an important question. Okay, the Ajami tradition and Arabic traditions of West Africans that have been brought to the Americas show the continuities of African epistemologies. For example, we know through some of the texts that we have found, that the incantations, for example, that are used are incantations from African countries, African societies. And these incantations, are designed to be protected, are designed to be used when someone needs protection. Some of them are designed to destroy one's enemy, okay? And all of these are rooted in the African traditions, that were brought to the Americas. Of course, when the enslaved Africans found themselves in danger in the context of enslavement, they deployed all these spiritual tools that they had as part of their struggle. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, examination of the texts that are produced by enslaved Africans in the Americas, and I mean beyond the United States, so Brazil, Jamaica, and other places, okay, will allow us to generate new understanding of who they were really, their level of education. For example, we can tell, based on the idiosyncratic features in their writing, whether these people had what we call basilectal level of education, elementary level, whether they had mesolectal level of education, whether they had intermediate level of education. We can also tell whether they were part of the crème de la crème, if they were, highly educated, based on language features they used, based on the mistakes they make, based on the inconsistencies or consistencies in their writing. So these documents allow us, therefore, to track not only the graphological evidence, the evidence based on writing, but also, the social context that produced them, allowing us to replace them directly in their communities with new evidence that we were not able to do before. Okay, so I think this is a new area that I hope to have a graduate student actually who would be interested in studying the corpus of existing Arabic and Ajami texts in the Americas as a way to trace and place them in their communities of origin, okay, and generate new profiles of who these people were, the social context that produced them, the intellectual tradition that shaped them. So thank you very much. That's a great question.
Yes. And I know that Elsa was asking what are the implications, for example, for Brazil. What I would add to that is that there is a need to sort of change the attitude, because for many years, those documents were in the archives, but researchers would go there and think that this is bad Arabic, right? That this is not useful. This is just something that was produced by these African Muslims who are not really very good Muslim, because there is also the assumption that, you know, the original Muslims, those who are practicing genuine Islam, are the Arabs, and Africans are just, you know, practicing a copy, not a good one, right? So whenever they encounter those things, what they would say is just, this is magic, right? And then they discard it. Now there is a need to go back to the archives, and not just the National Archives, but because what you have, for example, in the case of Brazil, is that many of these things, many of the useful archives are privately owned. So you have to have the networks that allow you to get back to those communities. And in my own work, I talk about also repatriating these things, not physically, but actually taking copies and getting to these communities, as Professor Ngom suggested. And because we have specialists, for example, of numerology. So if you want to understand a document that is dealing with numerology in Brazil, you need to take it back to West Africa, where you find experts, because most of the time, we scholars in North America don't have that training, right? So there is a need here to be in dialogue, right, with communities in Africa, but also in the African diaspora, and that also requires that institutions invest in African languages. So there is this need here to sort of go back to the archives, but also there is a need to invest in African languages, in also building these networks of people, of scholars traveling from the United States to Africa, etc. And that, for that to happen, also, I think migration or mobilities between Africa and the United States need to be facilitated, and the current context is not helping, I guess. On that note, Professor Ngom, the floor is yours for closing. Do you have anything else you want to add before
I just wanted to thank you all for coming, and this has been a wonderful conversation. And I hope that we will have the opportunity to continue the conversation, especially to make accessible these sources of knowledge, you know, to change the narrative so that, you know, we can see new perspectives that help us correct narratives about pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial Africa. So this has been an honor to be in conversation with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Jamba, okay. Bye, Mouti Chop, quoi. I'm going to.
Oh, that's it. You record.